Hello guys, in this video we will learn about the system configuration in the admin. The system configuration in the admin, you can go from by logging into the admin and then go to stores and then configuration. From the configuration then you will see these settings, the general, catalog, security, customers and so on. Now you can click on certain settings and then you can see those sections inside this tab, and then in the tab you will see groups, and then inside the groups you will see fields. So this is how it's being constructed. You will have tab as general, and then here web is a section, and then inside the section you will have multiple groups, and then inside each group you will have multiple fields, probably one field or more. Now we are going to create one tab with one section and multiple groups, and then we will see how the configurations works. We will cover most of the important topics or a functionality in the configuration. So let's get along with that. Now we created this module, and this module has nothing. It just have the module XML file and the registration. Now we have a typo here. We should start with training, and once we've done this we will just start on with creating the XML or the system configuration. We start with the XML file. It's called system.xml. So it's a system.xml inside admin HTML. So the module etc admin HTML and then system XML. We have the instructions, so it's just the config, and then inside it is a system. Now what we need to do here first is we need to create a new tab. So this tab, and then the ID will be training, and that's the sort order. Then we will just put like 10, and we will give it a label. So we will just go label, and then the label we will have it as a training. Now this is one thing. The other thing is we need to create section. Now the section is dependent of the tab. You don't have to create tab every time you create a system XML file, but because this is our first configuration, we will place it inside training tab. We will have a tab, it's called training here, like this, general, catalog and security. We don't have it, so we create it. If we have it, we just go ahead with section, and we don't need to write this tab. Now we go with the section. I'll write this section. We will just call it training, and then the sort order will be 1 inside the training tab, and then we show it in store, we show it on default, we show it on a website, and the type will be text, and that's the section. Now we need to specify the tab where you want to place it, so we will say training. So this section will be inside this tab, which is the training. Now what we need to do is we need a resource, and then the resource we will have Magento config. Now this is okay for now, but this is too general, and we need to create a separate resource for this. And to create a separate resource to this, we will need to have a ACL file. To show you the resources, if you go to the store or system, and then from the system you will go to user role, and then we have only one role, which is administrators. Administrators have access to all resources. So this is the role resource, and then the resource access to all. If you specify some of the resources, you can see here what is the available resources here. Now you will have the store, and then you will have settings. So you will have config. We specify Magento config, and this is all the resources, but this is too general and everyone will have access to it. But what we need to do is we create a separate resource. So to create a separate resource, we will go to etc, and then we have acl.xml file. Now in the ACL we will have it inside admin, stores, and then store settings, and Magento config, and then we will call it training, and then system config example, and then we will say config, and this is our resource, and then we will say training resource, or we just say system configuration. Now we have it as a training system configuration. We will copy the resource we created here, and then we will go to the system here, and then place it here. Now we have the resource, and then we will have the label. the label will be label, and then the label will be training system example. So we have this section, and then inside this section we will need groups. Now we will create a group, and then we call it training system, and then the type will be text, and the show as one, show as one, show as one, and then sort order as one as well. We close the group, and this group will appear inside the section because you only have it inside the section. So you will have training, and inside training will be the section ID as training as well. So this not to be mistaken or misunderstood as the tab, because this is a section and this is a tab. But what we can do here, we can do training example. So we'll have training example, and then system, and inside the system we will have the label, and then we call it system configuration. Now we have the system configuration here, and then we will need a field. To create a field, you call it field, and then the ID will be config1, we will call it, and then sort order 1, show as 1, show in default as 1, show in website as 1, and then the type will be text. Now once we have a text, we will have a label for this, and then we call it config1, just like this. Now what we need to do here is, now we need to run PHP setup upgrade. So now setup upgrade is done. What we need to look at, refresh the page. Okay, so we have this training tab, and then training system example, and then inside it we have this group, which is the system configuration, and then we have config1. You can see here it says store view. Store view means it could be done on default, and then can be on website, and then you can have it on store. So this is the, we go back to default. So this is the store view, so it can be set for the store view. Now we talked a bit about the ACL and setting the resources. Now if we go to the system, user role, administration or administrators, if we go to user roles, and then if we look at our guy, so if we search for training, so you can see inside the configuration you have training system configuration. So this is the resource we created, and once you create it, you can assign it to a role, and that role, because it belongs to user, or a user belongs to a role, then they will have access to this configuration from the admin. Now this is the tab we created, and it represented by this one. This is the tab, then the section, which is training example, and it's inside this tab, and this is the resource, and this is the label, training system example, and that's it. This is training system example. Then we have the group. The group is called system configuration, and this is the system configuration. This is the group. Then we come last to the field. This field is called config1, and it shows on store, default, website scopes. So these are the scopes that the config1 field is available on, and the type of it is text, which means is a text field. So this is the configuration, and this is how you create a text field with tab, section, group, and a field. Now what we can do here is, we created the field. Now we can have comment. To add a comment, we can just say comment, and then we can say, for example, this is a config1. I'm not sure why comment is highlighted as red or as wrong and doesn't belong here, but this is should be fine. If we go to the schema, the XSD schema, we can see the comment is part of the field here. So part of the field you can add comment, but it doesn't recognize it, and it's highlighting it as red. Anyway, this is not a topic we want to dive in, because this seems to be a bug in Magento 241. Now we should see the comment on the field, so we just need to flush cache flush config, because this is what we change in. Now if we refresh, and here we go, we have this note or this comment under this field. Now we have this, we need to consider to see how we can have multiple scopes on this config or any field we want. So we will have a new config here, we call it config2, then we remove and then we show it on default only, and this will be config2. Config2 will show on default only and won't show on the website or on store scopes. So if we just flush cache, then refresh, and we can see this is says as global scope. So the scope is global because we only have it as show on default equals 1, which means only on global. If we switch to websites, it's gone. You cannot set it on website and you cannot set it on store scope. It only shows on the default, and this is how it says is global. Now you can also do is, I think we can do here is we can have another one, and then we call it config3, and then we show it on default and show on website, and we name it as 3. Now this will show only on default and the website and doesn't show on store. So if we refresh, if we flush cache and then refresh, now you can see here is the scope is website and the config 3. So you have here as a story view, this is global, this is website. Now if we switch to website, we only have the store and website, but if we go to the website, we only have the config 1, which is the store. So this is only available on the store, and on the website will be also available, and the config 3 is available on the default. Everything is available. Now what if we have this as on website only, and then we call it config 4, and this is config 4. Now this should show on website only. If we flush cache, then refresh, now you can see you cannot see the config 4, but if we switch to main website, which is the website scope, you would see the config 4. If we switch to store, you don't see only this one because this is set on all scopes, all levels. On the website, config 4 is set to website only. You cannot see it on the store level, not on global level. So this is the config 4. Now if we go on config 5, and then we will have it on show on store, then we have it 5, flush cache, refresh. Now we have invalid because here is having the same ID, so we change it to 5, flush cache again, refresh. Now we still have those available on store, but if we go to website, you won't see the config 5, but if you go to the store, you will have 1 and 5. This field is set to show on store view only, so you cannot do it on, you cannot see it on website and you cannot see it on default. Let's go back to default. So these are the scopes, and this is how you understand the scopes. I think this is very useful in terms of whether you have a global value and then you want it to be different on store level or on website level. So we will come to that next, but this is how they show and how you can set them from different scopes and how you define them in the XML file. Now we have taken the comment, we have taken the scopes, and now we will go to dependency next. Now suppose you have a config 1, but you only want to show it on some cases, whether you want to have a field and you can say this field is enabled. Once this field is enabled, then you can show this. So let's go into example and then you can see. So let's suppose we have a field and then we call it config 1 enable or enabled, and then we show on store, we show on website, and then we show on default, and then the type will be select, and then we give it a label and we can say enable config 1, and then we will have a source model. The source model will be Magento config model config source yes no. So this is the field we created. Now we want to make this field dependent on this config 1 enable. To do this, we will have depends, then the field, the ID of the field is config 1 enabled, and then the value should be 1. What we're saying here is this config 1, this field depends on config 1 enabled when the value is 1, which means when it is enabled, when set enable config 1 to yes. When you set it to yes, then this will show. If you set it to no, then this will not show, will be hidden. If we just flush cache and then refresh, now you have the enable. Remember, the config 1 is dependent on enable config 1. If we set it to yes, it will show. If we set it to no, it will hide. So this is how you set the dependencies. Now I think this is clear. Now we go next to nested groups. You can have group and then inside this group different groups. How you make that? So we will have a different group, then we will name it nested groups, then the type will be text, then show on default, show on website, show on store. That's it. Now what we need to do here is we say system2 or nested groups. We will have label and we call it nested groups. Then we will have also group inside this group. Then we say nested 1, and it's exactly the same here. So we just copy, paste, and then we will have a label, and then we say nested group 1, and inside the nested group 1 we will have a field, then we say nested config 1, and then the type is text, show on store 1, show on website 1, show on default 1. And I think we are missing the sort order here. Then we only have one sort order 1. Now we need a label, and the label will say nested config 1. So we have this group, nested group. We will just copy it and then paste it here, and then we have nested 2, and this will be nested group 2, and then nested 2, then nested config 2. If we flush cache and then refresh, now you can see you have the system configuration and nested groups. If you click on nested groups, you will have nested group 1, and then you have nested config 1, and then nested group 2, nested config 2. You can have nested config or nested groups as well, and not just fields here. So you can have nested, and this is how it's shown. Now we have this nested groups. We will see on a scenario that is when you create a functionality, but you want this to have a value to make your functionality work. But on locally, when you develop the value, you will have to write it like say here hello, and then when it goes to staging or goes to testing servers or goes to different developers, they don't know they have to fill in this value. So how you fill it for them, how you instruct Magento to make this config fillable without saving the config here, without setting the value and saving the config. To do this, we just refresh here. Now we will be introduced to a config.xml file. So this config.xml file is exactly filling the forms or the configuration for you. So inside the default, because we are here on the global, inside the default we will go to training example. This is the section, and then from training example we will have system, so system, and then config2, and then we will say hello. If we flush cache, then refresh, and you can see it's being filled. And now you can commit your code, and when it goes to staging, the value for config2 is hello. Any one of the developers, when they work on your functionality, the value is hello, and then the functionality will be working based on the data you pass here. And rather than saving it from the config, you set it from the config file, and then you set the value you want to. So this is the configuration. Now suppose you have this config 3, and then you have, say for example, welcome to the training, and now I'm going to save, and you can have this training, welcome to the training. Now when we save, this information is already in the database. Now if you refresh, if you do anything, this information is already in the database. Now you want to override these in your functionality when you develop something, and you know what, I want this in a different format. Say for example version, I will add it version 1 for example, and then save it. When you save it, it only happens locally on your machine, and it doesn't happen anywhere else. If you want this to be changed anywhere else, you need to set it from the config.php file. However, if you do this in the config.php file, this will not be editable, but rather not editable unless you remove it from the config. However, if you go to the catalog and then catalog here, now you can see these information about layered navigation, and then say for example this display category filter, you don't want the category filter to be displayed on Magento, and then you want to switch it off. But to switch it off locally, or you want to switch it without anyone playing around with it, because you never want this to come back to enable. To disable it once for all without anyone being able to enable it again, you can use the config file. So let's go ahead and do this from there. So if we inspect, then catalog layered navigation display category. If I go here, then config, from the config I will just add system, and then I will have default. This is the default scope, and then we will have catalog, and then we will have layered navigation, and then what else we have here, layered navigation display category. So display category, and then you set it to 0. Now once you set this, you want to import the settings in order to override this one. So to do this, you'll do php and Magento app config import, and then you also need to flush cache afterwards. So flush cache and import and flush cache. If you do this, run it, now refresh, Now you can see it's been set to no, and no one is able to switch it back on because this is changed. If you go to default, however, because it's a store view, you cannot change it. If you go to website or to the store view, this is also is not, because whatever you place in the config.php file, you disable anyone to play around with the settings. So this is a useful case of disabling or setting a config in the admin panel without letting anyone to play around with it. So this will be committed because you're changing the config, and will be affected. All environments will be affected: development and live and staging or test environments. Now we have this config, but also we come across this config app config import. What you do here is you make an alignment and make Magento to import the settings and apply it on here. And once you do this, you flush cache. So this is the import, which is the opposite functionality of the dump. The dump will dump everything in the config from the current settings. We will come to that later. Now we have done. Now we need to look at setting a config, but from env.php file. So we have this config, and then we have this env file. Env file also you can set things from, but this env is a shared file and it's different on local from live. And when you do things here, this is a deployment file, and only sensitive data need to put here, and config is just general, anyone can look at it. But on env file is sensitive data like passwords or app keys for payment methods. Now you can do this, however you have to set it from the deployment process and not from local. But from local you can use it for development, because this is your local copy and no one has access to it and it's not shared with anyone. To do this, we have an example. For example, if we go to the database and then go to site and then core config data, and I will filter the path contains secure, and we will have the secure URL and base unsecure URL. If I change this to 2 and I change this to 2 and then save it, now Magento to site. Suppose we have this DB dump from somewhere else, say from staging or from live, and now they come with these URLs. So when they come to these URLs, you have to go here and then change them. Every time you do a DB dump, you have to change them because you want them to match your local URLs and not the live URLs. In order to ignore these and not change them anymore, you can do this as a trick to be done locally. You can do this. You can go system. So first of all, before doing anything, we will just flush cache and make sure the website is broken. So if we go Magento site.test will be broken, and Magento site.test from the admin and from the front end, they should be broken. And to fix them, rather than going to the database and change these URLs, we can change them from the env file. And every time we import data to here, we don't need to go back to these URLs and change them. Now if we go here, you can see privacy errors. So it goes to Magento 2. We don't have the Magento 2 URL, and this is what happens when you get a DB dump from server, from live or staging or from other developer. To make these match in your own URL, you can go here in the env file and then put system default web secure base URL will be this, but without here. Now this is the secure, and now we copy these and then unsecure. Now what we need to do is we need import and flush, and then we look at here, we delete the 2, we run our previous URLs, and we should see them fixed. Now you can see here we are going to the home page, so it's working in the front end and also working on the back end. So no matter what the URL is set on the DB, since you set them here to the correct URL, this will be always read first and taking this value over any other value. So locally, if you get data import from server or anywhere else, you can just set these in, and then the base URL is always like this. You can also do this with the payment methods like Stripe or SagePay or whatever payment method you can do, Klarna for example, whatever the payment method you can do locally. So you can set these credentials here, and then when you import the data, you can always go with these data you have locally and you can check out, you can place orders, you take payments on test accounts rather than the live accounts coming from the live. So this is a nice trick to work on development. Now since we have these 2 and 2, and then we have it Magento, just Magento here in the config file, it just works, doesn't matter because it reads it from this file and it's not reading it from here anymore. So this is how you would fix whatever comes from live or in the config file. Now I'm going to correct these back because I don't want to mess up things. Now it's not going to mess up things, but I'm going to delete these in a minute. Now we need to flush cache. Try again. This still reading this URL and not the one in the database. Even they match, it reads it from here. Okay, it's working here and it's working here as well. Now we go back to our tab and our configuration. We have in the store view, we need to go back to the default, and now we have this training in the website. So config.3 is welcome to the training. Copy it. If I go back, if I switch to website, I can set it different on website scope and then save. And then I can go here on the store. We don't have it in the store because this is a website. Let's go back what we were looking at. Not this one. We need something with, let's enable this. So on config1, because it's store view, you can have different values, different 3 values for it. So config1 on default. Now you can switch back to the website. You can have a different value as a on website, and then you can have a different value on config on store. So you can have 3 values for the same settings on default, on website, and on store. Now if we look at the config here, config1, so this is the config1 on 0 scope ID on the default scope, has config on default. On website it has config1 on website. On stores it has a config1 on store. So you can see these are 3 different values exactly for the same path, exactly for the same settings, but for different scopes. Now we have these. Let's go back to the default scope and then let's get this removed. Then if we go to the website, let's get it removed as well. So config.3, you can set these also from the command line. If you look at the PHP in Magento, and then you can have help. Now we need the command name, which is config set. This is what we need. This is how you set the configuration in the admin, but from the command line. Now you can see from help, you can have help and then type the command, and it will give you the arguments. You have value, you have path, you have value, and then the option. The options is scope, and then scope, code, lock, and all these variations. Now I will have this command, and this will be config set. The scope is default, and the path is example. We don't have example. We have training example. So training example system config.3, and it will be training config. So if I just save it, and this will be config.3, and this is training config. So you can set it from the command line. You can also have, don't think we have config4, do we? We don't have a config4, but you can have it exactly the same thing, but you will have it config training config on website, and then this will be config.3. The scope will be websites, and then we need the scope code because you could have more than website. So the scope code will be base. I'm telling it as base because if we go to the website, we have the code base for the main website. Now if I run it, so we have exactly the same config path, but it's training config on website. We have it training config here. Let's refresh. But if we go to the website, you'll have it training config on website. So this is how you set the configuration from the command line. I'm not sure if you need this, but just here to so you know. Now the big thing we will look at is the db dump. We will have a db dump now, but before that we will just back up our files, the config back, and then we back our env. So we have backups for our files. Let's exit everything. So we have the env backup and then the config backup. Now what we're going to do is we run the php and Magento. config dump. Now we did a dump. If we go back to our config, you will see we have many values being dumped into the file here, and also many configurations being dumped into our file here. Now, what's the difference between the configuration in the config file from the configuration in the env file? The configuration in the env.php file, these are considered to be sensitive, like passwords, and the ones in the config is not sensitive. The other one is the ones in the env considered to be environmental or deployment variation or variables. So these are set in the env, but on the config they're not. They just being shared across, and they will be applied on every machine when you commit your config file. The difference here, or the effect on Magento here, is you can see you cannot change anything. This is very bad behavior when you have all these dumps. So probably dump isn't the one you will need forever. The only thing you will need is when you want to deploy and you want no one to make any change here in the admin. So there's no point coming to the admin and do anything. But this is not the case on most websites. So I personally don't find it any useful here. Why would I disable any settings here? It doesn't make any sense. Now let's retrieve back, because I don't like this. Or before we retrieve back, let's have a look at the config and then look for config1. So config1 is config on default, and this is all config1 we have on store, and then we have on website. These are the configuration being dumped into the config. But what happens if you want them to be dumped into the env file? What you gonna do? So first of all, what we're going to do here is we will remove this, and then also, where are we? We'll remove those as well. Okay, so there's nothing here and there's nothing here. Now we need to run php magento config import and php magento cache flush config. Now if we go back, now you can see we are able to make changes. Now suppose you have this config and it's a sensitive data, say for example it is a password or something you don't want to share across in the config.php, and once you do dump, you don't want it to go in config.php, but rather you want it to go in the env file. To do this, you need to add the path into the sensitive data. To do this, we will need to go here and create a file, and it's a di.xml file, then m2 di, and then what we need to do is we look for type, and it's Magento config model config type pool. And then we will have arguments, and then the argument will be sensitive, and then the sensitive is array, and then we will have item. The item will be, of course, this one. So we just copy it here, paste it, and then string, and then we can say provide the value 1. Now we need to flush cache. Then we made this as a sensitive data, and next time you do app config dump, it will go to the env.php file rather than to the config.php file. So let's just wait for this to refresh, and then we will try the dump. Just make sure there's no errors, and here we go. Now let's have a look. php fn magento config dump. Now we will look at the config and then look at the config one. So there's no config one here, but if we look at the env.php file, we have it here. So this is because we did the settings here in the .xml file, and then we specify it as a sensitive data. Now I think this is too much information now, and it's taking very long to explain everything, but here it is. I think this is the end of the video. Please like and subscribe if you like it, and I see you next time.